There is a rare paradox in history, and it bears the name of Solomon, the one praised as the wisest among mankind, yet also remembered as a fool. And it is precisely this strange combination that makes him a mirror, both radiant and terrifying, for anyone who dares to believe that wisdom alone can save man. I once thought of him as an open book, where the first pages shone with brilliance, and the last was soaked in darkness. What haunted me was not that he could write words so precious that humanity would still quote them thousands of years later, but that he could write them while his heart was drifting away from the one who had given him that gift. You see, wisdom can be great, but wisdom without loyalty is like a lamp placed in the hands of the blind. The light still shines, but the one holding it wanders lost. Solomon stood at the summit everyone longed for. He had gold and silver, power, peace, a glorious temple filled with the cloud of God's presence, and fame, so great that the Queen of Sheba traveled from afar just to witness what was hard to believe. He had everything men think would bring happiness, yet in the end he confessed in Ecclesiastes that it was all vanity, a chasing after the wind. I cannot help but ask myself, what causes a man who began with such humility, who only asked for a heart that could discern right from wrong, to end in confusion and bowing before wooden idols he once knew to be nothing? The answer does not lie in one sudden fall, but in the small steps, the little compromises, the repeated whispers that just a little more will not hurt. His tragedy reminds me that what we call wisdom is not a permanent insurance. It is like a garden. If you do not tend it daily, weeds will grow, and though yesterday it was filled with flowers, today it may turn into ruins. I once heard someone say, wisdom is a treasure, but loyalty is the key to keep it. Solomon had the treasure, but he lost the key. And when that key was gone, the treasure became a burden, like the heaps of gold in his palace that brought him no joy. The paradox of Solomon is a warning that a radiant beginning does not guarantee a good ending. You may begin in humility, in the fear of God, in the desire to serve others. But if your heart leans toward power, pleasure, or political safety, one day you may find yourself standing far from the place where you once knelt to pray. I see Solomon as I would look into a mirror, and I see the shadow of modern man. Within, we too chase wisdom, fame, success. But sometimes it is these very things that draw us away from what truly matters. One day, when all is in our hands, we may be like Solomon, sitting in a palace overflowing with gold and silver, yet feeling empty inside. And then his words rise, not as the voice of an ancient philosopher, but as the echo of our own hearts. Meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. This is not the desperate cry of a failure, but the warning of a man who once stood at the height of the world and realized that without God everything is illusion. That is what makes Solomon a great paradox, a double-edged mirror, both radiant and shadowed, and each of us must choose which part of his legacy we will learn from. Solomon was not born into the ideal background of a prince. He entered the world out of a stain that all Israel whispered about, an adulterous affair between King David and Bathsheba, a woman already married, and that sin was covered by the death of Uriah, one of the most loyal soldiers. Their first child died immediately after birth, as a judgment from God, leaving David and Bathsheba with a pain that no throne could hide. Yet from that same tainted ground, Bathsheba conceived again, and this time the child lived, and his name was Solomon. The paradox lies in this, that in the midst of the mire of sin, God still planted a seed of grace. When I think of Solomon as a child, I imagine him not only bearing the curious eyes of a boy, but also carrying the whispers of the people, marked by a family wound that no one wished to recall. People could call him a child of sin, but God called him a child of promise. I realize that it is often the worst beginnings that open the path to unimaginable greatness, because strength does not lie in circumstance, but in the way God overturns the meaning of that circumstance. David had many other sons: Amnon, Absalom, Adonijah, all of whom had reason to believe the throne was theirs, yet each in turn was removed from the divine plan. Amnon, disgraced by his sin against his own sister; Absalom, full of ambition, rebellion, and destroyed; Adonijah, rushing to proclaim himself king only to suffer a humiliating downfall. Those who seemed fitting by human standards were not the ones God chose. And then God's gaze turned to Solomon, the child born of a storm, yet preserved to become the heir. This forces me to remind myself that our standards of worthiness are often completely different from the eyes of God. A child of scandal became a symbol of restoration. That story reveals a truth: that sin may be real, but it does not have the final word, for mercy is the line that ends the sentence. Solomon became proof that grace can transform what was considered failure into the foundation of a legacy. And I believe this is why God allowed the story to be recorded: not to glorify David, not to diminish the weight of adultery and murder, but to show that even in the bitterest failure, his hand was silently preparing a new beginning. I wonder how many times we also look at our lives through the eyes of the world, thinking that our background, our mistakes, or the stains of our past have ended our future. And yet the story of Solomon stands as a response that what begins in ruin can become the place where God builds a kingdom. When Nathan, the prophet who once confronted David with thunderous condemnation, became the very one who confirmed that Solomon was the chosen child to inherit the throne, I see a strange circle being closed. The one who once bore bad news now carried good news. The one who once broke David with shame now became the voice of assurance for the promise. This highlights a sharp truth: that God does not only forgive, he transforms what once recalled sin into a testimony of mercy. The child of scandal became the child of promise. And in that I see a lesson that cannot be overlooked: that in the very places we feel most ashamed, God sees an opportunity to reveal his glory. Solomon was not simply a prince in a palace. He was living proof of another paradox: that mercy is stronger than sin, and that the promise of God is greater than the judgment of man. Adonijah believed the throne was his because he was the eldest surviving son of David. And when he saw his father old and weak, he quickly acted, organizing his own coronation, gathering generals and priests to strengthen his claim. In his eyes, Solomon was only a weaker youth, the son of a woman once seen as a stain in the royal court, unworthy to ascend the throne. But men may blow trumpets, host feasts, and call themselves king. Yet that does not make them king. Destiny does not belong to those who rush to seize it, but to the one appointed by God. While Adonijah was feasting, news erupted from the city. Trumpets sounded, the people shouted, and the sound thundered like a storm: "Long live King Solomon!" The banquet turned into a bitter comedy. Those who had raised their cups to toast Adonijah trembled, friends fled, and the self-proclaimed king suddenly saw himself exposed before the truth. He found no safety in soldiers or allies. He could only run to the altar, grasping its horns as if clinging to a fragile hope. In Israel, seizing the altar was a plea for one's life, a way of begging that no one kill the one holding on to the holy place. Solomon faced that moment with the power to execute immediately and send a stern message, but he chose another way. He spared Adonijah on the condition of loyalty, warning that if rebellion rose again, his blood would be shed. That moment revealed a fearful combination. Solomon was both merciful and firm, holding power with conditional kindness. But the heart of man does not easily change. and soon Adonijah revealed a new plot, seeking to strengthen his claim through marriage, a scheme more subtle yet more reckless. This time Solomon did not yield. He ordered Adonijah executed at once. That was the first decisive step, showing that the throne was no longer a game for those who trusted in bloodline or position, but for the one chosen by God and strong enough to hold it with resolve. Before his death, David also charged Solomon to deal with those who had opposed the crown: Joab, Shimei, men who had stood against royal authority, lingering threats to the kingdom. And Solomon did just that, leaving no ghost of the past to haunt the throne. Joab ran to seize the altar, as Adonijah had once done, but this time blood was spilled on the sacred ground, a reminder that even the holy place could not save a traitor. Shimei was given a chance, ordered to remain in the city and not cross beyond, but he could not keep his word, and his end came like the blade of fate. The throne of Israel was secured by Solomon through both mercy and iron, and from there a dynasty truly began. The struggle for the crown was not merely a contest among the sons of David. It was a test revealing on whose side God stood. And when the dust settled and the trumpets fell silent, only Solomon remained firm on the throne. Proof that human power is an illusion, and only when set within the flow of God's promise does it endure. I see in that story a sharp lesson that many seek to seize power through schemes and celebrations. But the true throne cannot be stolen. It is upheld by the one who decrees it. Solomon ascended not with his hands stained by his brother's blood from the outset, but by letting their plots collapse under the weight of truth. And from there he began a reign that the whole world would look up to. Solomon could have secured the throne with blood and iron, but earthly power alone was not enough to lead a nation. One night at Gibeon he did something unusual, offering 1,000 burnt offerings, and then he fell asleep. In his dream, God appeared and asked him a question any human being would long to hear. Ask for whatever you want. I imagine that moment as if standing before an infinite treasure. You could choose gold, armies, or the death of your enemies. But Solomon uttered a different request. He said he was still like a child, unable to govern, and he asked for a heart that could discern between right and wrong to lead God's people. I see this as the turning point, where a man lets go of confidence in himself and takes wisdom as a gift of grace. That humility became the foundation of his reign, and God answered not only with wisdom, but also with wealth, fame, and glory, so that no one in his time could compare with him. I remind myself that what pleases God most is not always a grand request, but the humility of knowing one cannot bear the burden alone. The first wisdom of Solomon was the recognition of his own limits. But wisdom cannot remain only on the lips. It must show itself in action. When two women came with a child, each claiming to be the mother, with no witness, no proof, only cries and quarrels, I imagine the tension stretched like a tight string, everyone waiting for a judgment. Solomon did not rush to explain, and he called for a sword and commanded the child be cut in two, giving each woman a half. Those words froze the room. Many thought he was mad, but in that very instant truth revealed itself. One woman cried out, begging to spare the child and give it to her rival, while the other coldly agreed to the division, and Solomon, with only one glance, knew, give the child to the weeping woman, for true love would rather lose the child than see it slain. When I hear this detail, I understand that wisdom is not a trick. It is the ability to read the human heart and let truth expose itself. All Israel heard the judgment and stood in awe, and from then Solomon's fame spread everywhere. But what makes me reflect most deeply is that he did not ask for power to oppress, but for insight to serve, through wisdom, always serves justice, not to display intelligence, but to bring order to the community. Solomon began to write 3,000 proverbs, thousands of songs, teachings about justice, honesty, the dangers of lust and greed, even short sayings such as a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger, were enough to change the way people lived with each other. I sense in him a strange current, both king, put, and philosopher, and it was this that made his wisdom reach beyond the borders of Israel. Kings from all lands came just to hear him speak, because they recognized that this wisdom was unlike ordinary political cunning. It carried the breath of God within it. And I understand that it was that first choice, asking for a heart to discern between right and wrong, that opened the door for all other gifts to flow down. When a man chooses the most important thing, the rest will be added. But hidden within that radiant beginning was also a paradox, because wisdom is a gift, yet also a burden. It tests whether the bearer has the faithfulness to live according to what he knows. Solomon began with a humble heart, but the story that follows will show that keeping that heart is the fiercest battle of all, greater than any fought with sword and spear. The reign of Solomon brought Israel into a period never before seen in its history, a golden era where wars were silenced and prosperity spread across the land. If under Saul the people struggled simply to survive, and under David the borders were expanded through blood and sword, then under Solomon Israel became the center of trade, culture, and power. I see in him something rare. That true authority did not come from conquest, but from the art of peace. He opened the gates so that commerce flowed in like rivers of silver and gold. Fleets organized under his command cut through the waves of the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, sailing far beyond familiar borders, bringing back gold from Ophir, silver from Tarshish, ivory, monkeys, peacocks from lands so distant that the people of Israel had never imagined them. Jerusalem was no longer only the religious capital. It became an economic capital, a place where goods from 3 continents converged. The diplomatic wisdom of Solomon also lay in his political marriages, unions with princesses from neighboring nations, turning potential enemies into allies, and surrounding Israel with a protective circle of partnerships. Instead of spending lives on battlefields, he spent silver and gold to buy peace, and history records it as a brilliantly successful strategy. But that wealth was not only stored in treasuries, it became great works. The temple of the Lord, the royal palace, the city walls, the paved roads, all transformed Jerusalem from a small town into a magnificent symbol. The people walked the streets and touched polished stones, knowing they were living in an age like no other. The pinnacle of that splendor was Solomon's throne, carved from ivory, overlaid with gold, with 12 lions standing guard on either side, a sight that caused every envoy entering the court to bow in awe. And then the news traveled far, reaching the ears of the Queen of Sheba. She carried gold, spices, and precious stones across thousands of miles, just to see if the rumors were true. When she entered Jerusalem and saw the grandeur, when she heard the wisdom of Solomon, she exclaimed that even what she had heard was not half of the truth. I see in that moment that Israel had reached its peak of glory, a small nation, now respected by distant empires. People came not only to trade goods, but to seek counsel, to learn knowledge. The wisdom of Solomon became a diplomatic treasure more valuable than silver or gold. That golden age gave the people an unparalleled stability. Every household had its vineyard. Every family lived in peace. But within splendor, danger always hides, for wealth often breeds complacency. When the storehouses overflow, people forget they once ate manna in the wilderness. When the city shines with light, people forget the days they dwelled in tents. Solomon, the wisest of men, began to be intoxicated with his own triumph. I look at that golden age as at the highest mountain, where the sun shines brightest, but also where the coldest winds begin to blow. Just as Israel no longer feared enemies outside, the enemy within Solomon's heart quietly grew. The golden era stood as proof that his prayer for wisdom had been answered, but it was also the lesson that no victory guarantees long-term faithfulness. The glory of Israel sparkled, but beneath it the shadows had begun to creep in, and the footsteps turning away from God had already started to echo in the palace. The temple of the Lord in the time of Solomon was not merely an architectural work. It was a declaration of the identity of a nation. Since leaving Egypt, Israel had only a temporary tent called the tabernacle, but now for the first time they had a permanent house for the divine presence. Solomon mobilized tens of thousands of stonecutters, carpenters, goldsmiths, cedar wood from Lebanon, stones cut finely from deep quarries, gold from Ophir, silver from Tarshish. For 7 years, Jerusalem became a vast construction site. When the work was completed, 90 cubits long, 30 cubits wide, 45 cubits high, yet numbers could not convey the splendor. Every wall inside was overlaid with gold, the floor covered in gold, the altar, the lampstands, the doors, all of gold, 2 giant cherubim of olive wood, 15 cubits tall, their wings touching above the Ark of the Covenant. The sight was like a painting in which every ray of light reflected only the brilliance of precious metal. I imagine the people of Israel on the day of dedication, thousands gathered, the priests carrying the ark into the Holy of Holies, the music, the trumpets resounding, and then suddenly a thick cloud filled the place so that the priests could no longer perform their service. It was the presence of the Lord, a confirmation that the work was not only human effort, but the place he had chosen to put his name. Solomon stood before the people and prayed. His words were not proud, not praising the work, but confessing the weakness of gold and stone before the greatness of the Creator. He said, "The highest heavens cannot contain you, much less this temple." He asked that when the people looked toward this place, whether in battle or exile or famine, the Lord would hear from heaven and forgive. I find that humility powerful, because only in the moment of greatest glory, while still knowing one's smallness, that is the peak of wisdom. And the Lord answered with fire from heaven, consuming the offering, his glory filling the place. The whole people fell face down, their voices rising, "The Lord is good. His mercy endures forever." The temple became the heart of Israel, both a symbol of faith and a mark of history. Yet along with the confirmation came a warning. In the night the Lord appeared and said, "If the people humble themselves, I'll pray, and seek his face, he will hear and heal. But if they turn away and chase foreign gods, this very temple will become a ruin, a mockery to the nations." I shudder at that paradox, that the holiest place could become desolation if the hearts of the people betrayed. The Temple of Solomon was proof of God's blessing, but also a mirror hung before the nation, reminding them that gold and silver cannot hold the presence. Only faithfulness can. I realize that every human work, no matter how great, is fragile if not built on the right foundation. The Golden Temple was only a stage. The real question was whether the people would still fear the Lord. For you may build him a radiant palace, but if your heart builds altars for other idols, the temple loses its meaning at once. The splendor of the building was a mirror, and its fate tied to the loyalty of the people. The Temple of Solomon began in fire and music, but its story at last shows that the warning became reality, and that is the tragedy of every kingdom. When outward beauty cannot save an inward heart that has turned, the Queen of Sheba heard of Solomon not through petty rumors, but through stories woven across the land about a king whose wealth and wisdom surpassed all other kings on earth. She was not easily convinced. She too was a ruler, a familiar with self-important men and courts that boasted of greatness. But something compelled her to see with her own eyes, and so a vast caravan set out, camels laden with gold, spices, and precious stones, crossing deserts, traveling thousands of miles. I imagine the day she entered Jerusalem, her eyes sweeping over the palace, the polished stone streets, the magnificent temple, and finally resting on the throne where Solomon sat. It was not only jewels and gold, it was the balance of a king radiating wisdom when she presented her difficult questions, riddles unsolved even by her own court. Solomon listened and answered gently, each reply like a lamp shining directly on the secrets she sought to hide. She realized that this wisdom was not merely political cunning or vast learning, but something flowing from a higher source, and she had to admit what she had heard was only half. The rest was greater than any report. Her praise did not stop with Solomon. She also blessed the God of Israel, confessing that only a mighty God could raise up such a king. It was the moment a foreign queen bowed before the one still unknown to the world. But to me, that visit was not only a triumph, it was also a warning. When an outsider could recognize the true source of wisdom, the danger for Solomon himself was that he might forget it. Glory can deceive us into thinking that the light shines from ourselves instead of from the one who gave it. The Queen of Sheba departed with gratitude and abundant gifts, returning to her land, richer, but more importantly, enriched in understanding. Solomon remained on his throne, still celebrated, but applause itself is the most dangerous thing. I realize that the sweetness of praise is like strong wine. It numbs awareness and makes a man forget that today's success may become tomorrow's burden. That royal visit was like a mirror, reflecting not only what Solomon possessed, but also the danger within. When others come to you for wisdom, it is good. But when you begin to believe the wisdom belongs to you, that is when you lose everything. I see Sheba's journey as both a peak and a boundary line. It marked the moment Israel was most respected, but also the moment Solomon stepped closer to pride. The warning was present even in admiration. Like a lamp that burns brightest before it fades, glory itself is never the greatest enemy. Forgetting the source of glory is the sharper blade. And Sheba, while confirming the greatness of Solomon, also left behind an invisible reminder that no throne endures if the heart is no longer tied to the one who placed it there. Solomon did not fall in a single moment. He fell through small steps, steps that perhaps even he did not notice. At first he still prayed, still offered sacrifices, still spoke the name of the Lord. But gradually other voices crept in, the whispers of foreign princesses, requests that seemed harmless, a small altar for the god of Moab, a place of incense for the goddess of Sidon, a hilltop shrine for the god of Ammon. At first it was only a concession to please one wife, then another, and then more. His empire of diplomacy was built on marriages, but from there the cracks in his heart began to spread. I think about the danger of compromise. It never comes with the shape of a sword. It comes as a sweet whisper, making you believe that yielding a little is harmless, but a little added to a little is enough to change the whole direction. Solomon, the man who once built the temple of the Lord in pure gold, was now the same man who built altars to foreign gods within Jerusalem itself. The capital was no longer the holy city. It became a marketplace of dozens of faiths. And the tragedy lay in this: he did not only allow others to worship, he himself bowed down and offered incense. The one who once wrote that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom was now kneeling before lifeless idols. I realize the human heart is never neutral. It either turns toward God or leans gradually toward idols, and mixture is always the stepping stone to betrayal. The compromise in Solomon's heart was not an open renunciation, but a false parallel, keeping the temple of the Lord while also building temples for other gods. It was the most subtle deception, making him think he was still secure. And I see myself also warned, because how many times do we believe we still worship God while in another corner of the heart an altar has been raised to money, to fame, to pleasure? Solomon lost his sensitivity. He no longer heard the warnings of conscience. And when God judged him, he was called one who had turned away. Bitter indeed. A man who began in humility, ending in pride. A man once praised as the wisest becoming the most foolish, because he could not keep his heart. I think the greatest wisdom is not solving hard riddles, but remaining faithful to the end. And here Solomon failed. The warning rings out for every generation. That compromise in the heart is the road to collapse. Not with a roar, but with soft steps leading down into the abyss. When old age came to Solomon, the palace still glittered with gold and silver. The throne still stood in majesty. The servants still bowed low. But within him there remained only an emptiness that words could not capture. He looked back on the years gone by and wrote in Ecclesiastes that vanity, all is vanity. Every work, every pleasure, every triumph is only a passing breath, like one who chases the wind. I read those lines and feel the weight of a soul who once had everything yet kept nothing. The man who once bowed down to ask God for wisdom now confessed that he had let his heart lean toward idols. He who once built a glorious temple for the Lord also built altars for foreign gods. He who once wrote proverbs about faithfulness betrayed the very things he proclaimed. And it was this contradiction that turned him into a shadow in the final years of his life. I imagine the aged Solomon sitting in his palace, hearing music and songs of celebration, yet to his ears they sounded only like the wind rushing through rocks. He once had 1,000 wives and concubines, yet he was lonely in spirit, for true love is never found in political marriages. He once had wealth unmatched by any man, yet he felt himself poor in spirit. His regret was not only because he had done wrong, but because he knew he had once walked rightly, once had the light, and then lost it. The most painful thing is not being lost, but once seeing the path and then turning away. That is why the words of Ecclesiastes sound like a late confession. He wrote that he denied his eyes nothing they desired, yet in the end it was all vanity. He said there is a time to build and a time to tear down, a time to laugh and a time to weep, as if arranging his life into rhythms of loss and realizing that the final rhythm still led to emptiness. I think about this and see that the lesson of a lifetime can be summed up in a few words: fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. How ironic that a man who once wrote thousands of proverbs would end by condensing them all into one short sentence, but perhaps that is the proof he understood, that wisdom cannot save the heart. If the heart is not bound to the one who gave wisdom, I see his image as a mirror, reflecting my own life, reminding that we may build dazzling empires, but if we do not keep faith, in the end we will sit and watch it all fade like smoke. Solomon died as a great king in the eyes of the people, but as a man of regret in his own eyes. And what remains for us is the question, will we let our lives end in light or in the shadow of vanity? When I close the story of Solomon, I do not see it as only a chapter in the history of Israel. I see it as a mirror reflecting directly into my own life, a king who began in humility, asking for a wise heart, and received more than he ever asked for, but ended in compromise and regret. This makes me realize that a radiant beginning has never guaranteed a good ending, and the first light can vanish if the heart goes astray. Solomon teaches me that great gifts do not automatically preserve the soul. They require faithfulness to be nurtured every day. I ask myself how many times I too am like him, beginning with sincerity, but gradually allowing small compromises to creep in, convincing myself that I am still in the truth. While part of my heart leans toward illusions, the image of Solomon building a temple for the Lord and then erecting altars for foreign gods chills me, for I know I too can do the same, not with gold and stone, but by placing money, fame, and pleasure on the high place of my heart. And then I understand it is those unseen idols that can make me forget the one who truly blesses. From this story, I learn a principle that true wisdom is not in eloquence or knowledge, but in keeping the heart faithful until the end. Anyone can begin with the fire of passion, but God looks for the flame that still burns on the final day. Solomon reminds me that a human life can be summed up in one sentence: fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. All knowledge, all achievements, all palaces, in the end vanish, and only the relationship between man and the Creator remains. I see that I must learn from the glory of Solomon to know how high God can raise a man, and learn from his failure to know how far a man can fall when he loses faithfulness. This makes me see him not as a distant figure, but as a living warning for today's generation. We too live in another golden age, with knowledge, with technology, with power, with temples of steel and glass, but our hearts are still as easily divided as in the past. I believe the greatest lesson we inherit is not the celebrated wisdom of Solomon, but his regret, because through it we know that all outward splendor means nothing if the end is only a sigh. The only thing that truly remains is the question, have I been faithful? Have I kept the flame from beginning to end? And in the silence of that question, I realize that the true value of life does not lie in what we build, but in the one for whom we have lived. Solomon left me not only Proverbs, not only the pages of Ecclesiastes, but a lesson that spans every generation, that beginnings matter, but the ending defines the whole of life. And if there is any echo that lingers after reading his story, it is this call: do not let your life end in vanity, but live so that until the final breath your heart remains whole with God.